I'm going to share some research findings into living mulches that were done on farm over the last sort of 4 years. And then Matt's going to talk about what he's doing on the Fring estate with living mulches. So, just get this to work. There we go. So what are living mulches? They're a semi-permanent ground cover that you can direct drill cereals into, in essence. The first recorded trials on them were done in the 40s in America. That's the oldest I found back. So as with most things in life, nothing is new. There's loads of reasons why you might consider them or are interested in them, and the turnout here kind of shows there is good interest and has been for quite a few years. In a perfect world, if you put all the papers together on living mulches, they are going to basically transform your farm. They're going to reduce runoff, suppress weeds, they're going to improve soil health, they're going to enhance insect populations, they're going to reduce costs, improve soil health. I mean, the list goes on, you know, and as you'll hear today, trying to get all these things out of living mulches is nearly impossible. But there's ways to approach it, there's things to consider that can help you get more of these positives out of the system. The research I'm going to look at comes originally from an innovative farmers lab that was a 3-year project. It included AHDB, Organic Arable, and the Organic Research Centre. So there's some research from there into sort of what the system was doing to the soil health and yields. And then last year, we were funded by the Elizabeth Gilmore Charitable Foundation, and we did more research into soil health and looked at beneficial insect populations. So the system that we used in these trials, it was a white clover mix that was oversown into a spring wheat. It was 70% Aberace and 30% Aber Herald. It's quite important that what you choose your living mulch to be in terms of vigour, and I think Matt will share a couple of stories where it was slightly over vigorous. The Aberace is a wild, low-growing, small-leaf clover, and the Aber Herald is a medium-sized clover, so that's also got quite a low-growing habit. That's really quite important, and that was sown at a rate of 7.5 kilos a hectare. Really, that's kind of the establishment phase. The true living mulch is in the second year. So after harvest, winter oats, wheat or rye, all three were done across the trials, direct drilled into that living mulch, and that mulch was then grazed in sort of January time. These trials are done on organic farms, so because of the weed burden, something we'll talk about in a bit, after that second year of the living mulch, you know, it was a herbal ley was stitched into the living mulch that was then used for grazing sheep. So a couple of considerations within this, and that goes to anyone if they're looking into the system. You know, the living mulch variety selection is really important. Depends on your soil type, depends on the varieties you're choosing. That cereal selection is critical. It massively affects yield. And then the variety of that cereal is also really important. In some of the trials, we saw modern wheat varieties getting pulled down by clover that's just too vigorous for it. And then there's also generally the management of the living mulch as it grows to knock it back and the times that you do that. So just going from, I think it's on your left, is it? Yeah, the first table, available nitrogen massively increased after 2 years of a living mulch, which you'd expect. You know, the clover is fixing nitrogen. The big issue that lots of people have is the yield penalty. So in that middle chart, this is a crop of wheat, and there was a 30% yield penalty. So for some people, you're like, there's just no way, we're not going to do that. You need to consider that in that year, cost of production was reduced by 20%, so you're reducing that. And if you weren't growing wheat, in last year's rye trial, the difference in yield the penalty was only 8% from the mulch to the control. So again, it just highlights the importance of variety selection and cereal selection. Weed control is a massive thing that's touted for living mulches as a benefit. That sort of top chart shows that overall weed prevalence is reduced massively through the use of living mulches. But what you see in the one underneath is that the percentage abundance of perennials jumps up above annuals. So on this particular farm, they had a massive charlock issue. That was almost knocked out, but thistles and docks, they really come into their own in that living mulch system. Again, it was an organic farm, so there are other control methods available if you're not organic, and that might mean you can run the living mulch system for a bit longer and not suffer from the perennial weeds. Soil structure, this is last year's result. Soil structure across all the sample plots in the living mulch, way higher. And that's kind of was found in the years before as well. Also, earthworm population and abundance massively improved in the living mulches. Slightly kind of unsurprisingly, from one avenue, unsurprisingly, slug population is much higher in the living mulches. We did think that the carabid beetles would love the living mulches and they would then predate on the slugs and therefore reduce the slug numbers. But what we saw was lower carabid numbers and massively increased slugs. So this needs a bit more research, because overall the insect diversity is much higher in living mulches. But looking at coming into this year, the farmer who had the 8% rye reduction yield penalty, he thought rye's the answer. I'm going to do it with rye. That will solve all of my problems. The high slug populations, the slugs loved the rye, and they knocked out 80% of the crop before we even got to late May. So again, this is sort of what we're coming to, is the farmer insights to mix with the research. As a single line practice, as an individual practice on a farm, it's got a lot of faults. It's a lot of issues with it. But if you're looking at it a whole systems approach, if you're using it to extend your rotation, if you're using it to build more resilience into your system, it's a really useful tool. I love them. I think they're one of the best things, but I'm deeply aware of the flaws that exist across the system. So the quality of the herbal ley, Mark Lee, whose farm a lot of the trials are done on, says the herbal ley that he stitches in and fattens his sheep on is absolutely glorious. He fattens his sheep up better than anything he's ever used before. It is, the whole thing is season specific, crop specific, site specific, as a lot of things are. And your farm, one system may work for you, for your neighbour it's not going to work, so it's a bit of trial and error. There is significant cost reduction within it because of the lack of using tractors for other things, to get onto the land. And one of the big things that Mark pointed out was that this higher seeding rate is needed within the living mulch. This is due to the lower tillering that's happening in the cereal crops under the mulch. Last little thing before I hand over to Matt is that the big challenges as you look at the system, if you think about implementing it, establishment is a major issue if you have a very dry spring. If you're trying to establish that clover in sort of May time, April time, it's very dry. If it doesn't establish, when you go into the proper living mulch year, it's going to be very patchy. You're going to suffer from a lot of weed burden, and you're not going to get the benefits that the whole system really should be bringing in. The management of the clover is really significant. I mentioned earlier that you can end up with wheat crops being pulled down by the vigorousness of the clover. And again, the cash crop variety selection can affect that quite significantly. Just the last point, to go back again, perennial weed management is really big. If you're organic, really you can't run this system beyond 1 year of true living mulch. But if you're conventional, then there's other options available to you. That's it from me. I will hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, so I farm on the Fring Estate in northwest Norfolk. Part of the farm is tenanted from the Sandringham Estate, and that part of the farm is farmed organically. Now, this is the area of the farm that we're trying the living mulch trial on, and this is quite difficult because it's very light, sandy soil and pretty low fertility. So it's been a bit of a challenge this year to get the living mulch working, but it seems to have done. So within our rotation, we're growing cereals, linseed, peas, and we also have pigs and cattle grazing on leys as part of that as well. So why living mulches? So Matt's run through quite a few of these points already, but I guess the key point for me really is that I want to harvest the sun's energy in July, August and September when the solar radiation is at its highest. And typically, most farms, including ourselves, have absolutely nothing growing on the ground at that time of year. So I think it's key to make the most of that sun while it's there in the summer. And then a number of the other points here Matt's already talked about, so I'll just skip over those. So I'll run you through our experiences on the Fring Estate with living mulches and how we've got on. So to start with, the first year, we had some established red clover, which I thought would be a good idea to try and establish some cereals into. What we did with it, we took a cut of silage off it in the autumn, and then in the spring, we intended on sowing spring barley around March time. Now, I tried this in 3 different ways. I ploughed and drilled it, which was sort of the farm standard. I then min-tilled and drilled it to try and knock the clover back a little bit. And then we tried direct drilling it straight into that clover sward. Now, obviously, the ploughed and drilled, the farm standard, was a success. But the min-till and the direct drill were a complete failure. I think this is probably for 2 reasons. Firstly, trying to sow a crop in March doesn't really give it enough chance to get away from the clover, especially when we were dealing with red clover, which is very aggressive and definitely not a species I'd use again in a living mulch. I thought it's worth mentioning that in this year I was also trying intercropping out. And this gave me some really interesting insights into what growing two species in the same field could give you as a benefit to your crop. So we were trying peas and barley, and also beans and oats in the rotation. And straight away, I was seeing some real benefits. You see the picture on the left there was a crop of oats where it's looking really healthy versus the monocrop of oats where the oats really weren't looking quite so good. So definitely some real benefits just to general plant health by having it growing with a legume. I was then also seeing some real benefits for weed control where I had a bicrop in place. The picture on the right there shows a bicrop of beans and oats on the left, and then a crop of beans on their own, which are absolutely choked out with fat hen and thistles. So straight away, you're seeing some real benefits just controlling the weeds of having those oats growing with the legume. On top of that, throughout this period, I was seeing how having clover within the rotation, especially when you can have it there for an extra year, really improves the following crop. So you see from this green area index map there, that area there, we left 2.5 hectares for another year, and you could really see the benefit to the following crop. The picture on the left is taken from inside that darker area, whereas the picture on the right is taken from the rest of the field. So definitely, I mean, it goes without saying really that clover increases fertility, but I wanted to find a way of bringing this within our rotation, and living mulches seemed to be the answer. So with that, last spring in around April, I established Jura white clover, which was undersown into a spring barley crop in April. Now, luckily, it was a really wet harvest, so the clover really grew away quite nicely. So by the time it came to harvest, we had a really nice green mat right the way across the field. And once the crop was off, it really sort of exploded into life. Now, straight away, in that living mulch, I was seeing some benefits quite quickly. So versus a bare stubble on the left there, doing a worm count in September, I was finding pretty much no worms in there at all. Whereas in the living mulch that same time, I was finding 10 worms plus. So instantly seeing how the clover is really feeding that life in the soil. So now we had this nice clover sward established, it was really trying to work out how you get a crop going. So this is what the field looked like on the left there. And then then in October and November time, we then got some sheep onto the field and grazed it really, really tightly, almost to the point where you could see sort of bare soil on the ground. The next step was then to sow some Mascani winter oats. So I sowed them on the 10th of November, 400 plants per square metre. That was around 20% higher than the farm average when we were sowing just into plough work. And you can see from this picture here, the clover had started to go into dormancy, and about 3 weeks later, it was a nice mild December, the oats really started to grow away quite well as the clover was going dormant. As part of this demonstration, I also had a control where I just ploughed in the clover and established oats, and I also tried a min-till just to see how those two compared with the living mulch trial. So after what was a very mild winter, on the 13th of February, this is how the oats looked, which is kind of just how we wanted them to look. They'd grown away really well, got established. The clover was still sitting there, not really growing, still in dormancy. And around this time, I also managed to get around 20 cubic meters of digestate onto the field, just to try and give the oats a bit of a push to get them going. Now, by the end of March, the clover really sort of kicked into life, as you'd expect it to. But luckily, the oats were growing very well too. So both of them sort of came up together. And this is, again, how I really wanted it to look at this time of year, with both of them growing well, the clover covering all the ground there, so keeping all the annual weeds down, which is key in our organic rotation. So in March, then I also, at that same time, I did another soil test, a worm count even. And again, looking at the ploughed versus the living mulch, I was only finding around 1 or 2 worms in the plough work. Whereas if you go to the living mulch field, I was finding sort of 15 to 20. So definitely another real obvious indicator that the living mulch is doing some real good for the soil. And then similarly to the bicrop, I was seeing how the oats just looked a bit healthier in the living mulch versus your normal ploughed field. So again, something going on there with the two working quite well together. So how does the clover look now? So this is how it's looking at the minute. It was quite touch and go right the way through spring. They looked very, very even. They were sort of competing with each other quite heavily. But luckily, as the panicles started to emerge, the clover really did start to take over. The oats really started to take over, and the clover was just sitting in the bottom of the oats there, so it looked really good. The clover was doing what we wanted it to. If you look at the roots there's some nice nodules on there. It was fixing nitrogen in the soil. It was sitting in the bottom of those oats. The only downside I was seeing on areas of the field where the fertility was particularly low, and we do get quite a lot of variation in our organic system, especially with pigs. On those low fertility areas, the tiller numbers did seem to be quite significantly down. So that's just something to consider going forward. However, in the field where we had really high fertility, especially on areas where the pigs had put down quite a lot of nutrition a couple of years before, this is where the living mulch really does seem to have worked. There was plenty of nutrition there to really get the oats growing. So they did shade out the clover. They tilled out nicely. There's a Labrador in that picture for scale somewhere, just to show how tall they did get. But no, they were looking really good. So what does that mean for yield? Well, I've sort of done some tiller counts to try and get an idea what yield I can expect this year. And looking at the tillers, we are around in the living mulch, we've got around 228 tillers. Whereas in the control, there was around 324, so quite significantly down on tillers. So it's looking like there may be up to a 20% yield penalty from the living mulch versus the control. However, it is worth mentioning that the actual panicles the plants look a lot healthier, so there seems to be more seeds per panicle in the living mulch field than in the control. So that might help bring yield up a bit also. It's also worth mentioning that there is a 20% yield loss here, but actually in an organic system, we are building fertility in the rotation, which is kind of key when the control there is all that's doing is depleting it, and it's a second cereal, so it's never going to do particularly well after that. Whereas I could pretty much guarantee after the living mulch trial, I'd get a pretty good crop afterwards. Added to which, we've managed to get a crop established in a way without any major weed problems and without having to till the soil, which is something I haven't really done before organically. So the key lessons I'd give to you, just take away if you were going to try it at home. I'd say that spring crops definitely don't work. There's not enough time for them to get established and get away from the clover. And then if you are going to try autumn crops, I think it's key to sow once the clover has gone into dormancy, or at least is going into dormancy, so just before it goes into dormancy. And then if you can, knock it back with sheep or something, that will give you oats or whatever cereal you're growing a much better chance to get away. And then finally, the living mulch does seem to have been a success in these areas of the field where I've got lots of fertility. So maybe in a conventional system, or perhaps if I fed the crop a bit more, I might have got different results. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. Any questions at all?
Thanks, Matt. That's great. I am really impressed with your commitment to a solid research trial there with a control and some other things. So that's brilliant work, mate. And long may it continue. So we just want to open up the floor to any questions. If you've got, we've got one at the back right up there, please.
Thank you. Could you talk a bit more about whether it would work this year? Would you keep using that living mulch in an organic system? And the first speaker, you said it wouldn't work because the build-up of weeds. But that's obviously the holy grail for organic, where we end up using the plough, which makes us very unpopular at places like Groundswell.
So I think I'm looking at Mark Lee's system. He's up in Shropshire. That second year of living mulch, the increase in perennial weeds, particularly on his farm, it's sandy loam. He's got outrageous levels of thistles and outrageous levels of docks, which means he just has to plough. He puts it into a fertility building lay, and then he goes back to ploughing to control those weeds. He would rather not. He'd love to do more. And I know of some conventional farmers who are running that living mulch for 2 or 3 years in its full state, but I haven't seen any organic farmers who have had to terminate. I don't know what you're going to do on that, Matt.
I think with that field, we probably will try it for another year. We do have a few thistles coming in, but no more than in the sort of farm standard where we ploughed it. So I think it'd be a shame not to then try and have another go and see if we can get another cereal established. Whether I try rye or winter oats, we haven't quite decided yet. But
yeah, I think looking at Mark's situation is that if he has poor establishment and you've got patchy germination, you're on the back foot. So it may be that you have if you had fantastic germination and coverage, that perennial weed issue is going to remain lower, so you might get away with it for a couple of years. You'll have to come back next year to hear what Matt says about how that works. Any other questions? Down here, it's making you walk all the way across, and then we're going to go in the middle after that.
Hi, Matt. I'm a very novice organic farmer, and I've got a living mulch which has established well, and I've got a first wheat that is looking quite good at this stage. What would you do, because I want to follow it on with another cereal? Would you have to follow that? Do I have to follow that with wheat, or would I be able to follow it with oats, do you think, if I planted it late and let sheep graze well into the autumn, the wheat stubble?
I think any cereal, if you can guarantee it can get away and get ahead of the living mulch, I think that's key. It needs to be competitive and be able to, in the spring, come out the blocks and really start to shade out the clover. So I think that's the issue we've had in a few places where it doesn't shade out the clover is when the clover starts to take over a bit, and that's where you start to lose those tiller numbers in the field, I think. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to try. I think I might try winter rye because I know it's going to be competitive out the blocks. But I'm sure you could probably have another go with wheat again or winter oats.
Okay, we're going to 2 more questions. We'll just go quickly on the right behind this chap, and then we'll jump to our man in the middle.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I've got a living mulch in situ at the moment, which is looking a lot less good than yours. I've got a couple of questions. One is what drill you used, and the second one is, was there any mechanical weeding or sort of management of the clover post-sheep grazing?
So we've got a horse pronto, which isn't a direct drill, but luckily we're on quite light sandy soil. So if I drill into it with the pronto and roll afterwards, it does sort of seal the slot, and it seems to work. So I mean, potentially we could have got better establishment if we did have a proper direct drill. And then the other question, sorry, what was the other question? I tried. I was harrowing the field next door, just in a ploughed field next door, and I thought I'd run over the clover and see if that did anything. But no matter how aggressive I went with the harrows, it didn't really touch the clover at all. I left a couple of strips I didn't touch, and you wouldn't have spotted it.
Right, last question in the middle. Yeah.
Hiya, I'm a biocomplete compost maker, and I'm fascinated. That's another type of living mulch, isn't it? The maximum biology compost, and sort of had this. Basically, I don't know why sort of seed composts don't exist to sort of complete the regenerative soil cycle. You get the biology back, and then you get the plant roots in one application. I was just wondering if you guys had any experience, had a thought about applying cover crops with biology, extracts or compost, and whether or not you can imagine that helping or being viable. It's possibly just not economically viable because of the way that farming happens, but I'd just be really interested if you had any experience with that.
I haven't got any experience with it, but there's a chap speaking tomorrow afternoon at 3:15 in here, Tom Knowles, and he applies Johnson Sioux based compost teas onto his arable crops, and he is using a wild farm system, so there's going to be some form of bicrop or undersowing in there, so it might be worth to come and have a chat with him. I don't know if you've had any experience with that.
Not really. I'll just say the more fertility you can get into an organic rotation, the better. So if you're putting on compost and then seeds afterwards, that all sounds great, really. So, yeah.
We're going to have to leave it there, folks. We've overrun. Thank you for your time. If you need any more information, come and see us over there.